I think the Chinese are wary. I think they're a little bit wary about showing their more sensitive capabilities to the Russians and vice versa. And I think they're worried about being seen as a military ally of the Russians. The Chinese they're balancing, they're hedging. They're not doing nothing, but they're not going so far that they're going to be sacrificing or endangering their relations, both with Europe and, for that matter, with the United States right now, which they are trying to stabilize somewhat. And so I think for them, they've been cautious in these sorts of endeavors.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Jabot. And today I'm joined by a senior research fellow at the Centre for Study of Chinese Military Affairs. Dr. Joel Wuthnow is a specialist in China, including its foreign policy, its military, US-China relations and strategic developments in East Asia. He's the author of several books, including China's Senior Military Leadership and Crossing the Strait, China's Military Prepares for War with Taiwan. Joel, welcome to Frontline. It's great to have you here. Thank you for your time. Could we start by you giving us an overview of China as a military power in terms of its size and capability of its forces?
Sure. Thanks so much, Kate. China has a regional military right now. The power within Asia, they're not yet a global military power. I think if you compare them to Japan or Korea and certainly to Taiwan, they're formidable. Their missile forces are second to none. Their air and sea forces are quite good. And so from a perspective of potentially warfighting or deterring regional adversaries, yes, they're a very modern military. But unlike the US military or to some degree the Russians, they can't really project combat power overseas right now.
And President Xi is currently continuing a decades-long reform of the People's Liberation Army, and he's making big administrative and organizational changes to improve its capability, its capacity to fight. Why does China feel the need to project power and be war ready if that's what you believe is happening?
Well, I think Xi Jinping is about giving his country options for the future. So here in the US and elsewhere, we've heard this date of 2027 for China potentially to be ready for war against Taiwan and the United States. I think when Xi Jinping is instructing the military to set its sight toward these goals, he's saying, we're not ready today. We're a good military. We can deter. We can do small conflicts, but we're not ready for a large war, especially against the United States. And so he's given them a near-term deadline to get better ready. And that means capabilities. That means organization. It means people. It means the whole gamut of military modernization. But he's put them on the clock, essentially, to get ready.
Put them on the clock, and your recent article in Foreign Affairs points to the recent disappearance of some of China's most senior generals. The title is Why Xi Jinping Doesn't Trust His Own Military. So it's a purge. What's been going on?
Well, it's still a little bit unclear exactly what's happening, but a number of senior leaders in the PLA have disappeared, including the leadership of the Rocket Force, which is their nuclear force. The defense minister and some others as well have disappeared. It seems that they've been purged. No charges have been filed yet on them. It's not clear whether this is political or if this is about corruption, but there's certainly a problem. And so I think it suggests to people that Xi doesn't have total confidence right now in some important people in his senior military leadership. And I think that's getting a lot of his attention right now.
I appreciate it is difficult to know exactly what is going on, but do you think the disappearing generals is a sign of rejuvenation or some kind of collapse?
No, I wouldn't say that it's a sign of collapse. I think that, in general, the politics in China right now are fairly stable. I think what he's going after are some bad apples, folks that potentially have been involved in some corrupt schemes. For example, the Rocket Force has been awash with money in the last few years to build a much larger nuclear arsenal. And so there are opportunities for corruption. And so I believe that Xi Jinping is trying to get after some of the problem cases in his leadership. I don't think this suggests that the PLA is not on the same page with him or that he's worried about a military coup or something more dramatic like that.
And there have been several attempts to reform China's military. Why might this one work?
Well, Xi Jinping is more powerful than his predecessors. If we dial back the clock, go back to the 90s or 2000s, there were plans on the book to make the PLA more modern and better organized. But Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, who preceded Xi Jinping, they couldn't get it done. They had very little influence inside the PLA. Xi Jinping came in a decade ago and he cleaned house. He put his own people into place. Still some potential bad apples there, but he was able to get through one of the largest military reforms to their structure since the 1950s under Mao Zedong. And so the PLA today in 2023 is better organized, is better equipped, and it does have, I think, some better people than they did back in the 90s and 2000s. And a lot of the credit, in my view, can go to Xi Jinping.
And what exactly is the nature of that military reform you mentioned?
Well, what he's trying to do is to create a different structure for leading troops. So here in the United States, our military is what we call joint. So commanders oversee troops from the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, and so on. In China, that wasn't really the case until a decade ago. You had a commander that only oversaw ground troops. So that's fine if you're talking about Cold War style land battles, but it doesn't make sense for modern warfare. Right. So, for example, if you're going to go to war against Taiwan, you need to carry out an island landing or a blockade. These things are very joint. And so their command structure had to be modernized. And so that's exactly what they've done. They've created now a system where you have commanders in the theaters, so they have 5 theaters, and at the national level who have a much broader range of authority over troops. So that's good for training, it's good for organization, and it's good for moving the PLA if they ever needed to from a peacetime footing into a wartime footing. So it's really about efficiency.
And Xi's attempt to increase state control over the Chinese economy has been blamed for the slowdown in the country's economy. Could it have the same kind of effect on the military, do you think?
In my view, it's not likely. Xi Jinping has prioritized security spending that's both internal security and external security. He's willing to keep the PLA budgets growing apace. Even when the slowdown is going on in China, during the 2 or 3 years of the pandemic period when China's GDP growth went very badly and negative. In fact, PLA budgets continue to grow at a normal rate. So I think that suggests his prioritization. He's saying that we, China, are facing many security threats from states, from Taiwan, from the United States, from other countries, from others. We need to have powerful security forces, not to guarantee the nation only, but also to guarantee the party. And so he's saying we will make that a priority. We'll continue spending as much as we can on the military, and we're not going to let the slowdown get in the way of that.
And what is the message that the Chinese Communist Party is actually giving to its armed forces about why the reform is needed? Is it that same message?
They're saying that we need to be ready to fight and win wars. This is absolutely a readiness message. It's a message, but it's also saying you're not there yet. And so when they talk to themselves, when they critique their own weaknesses and their own fallibilities, they're saying our people aren't good enough. They're not battle tested. We haven't seen war since 1979. And our organizations have been outdated. And so the time is now, the time is right to get after some of those problems that eluded Chinese leaders back in the 90s and the 2000s. They can't continue to be complacent about military modernization and reform. So that's been a major message for Xi Jinping over 10 years. And again, I do think he's had a fair degree of success in doing that.
And you mentioned earlier that the necessity for the development of the naval capability is crucial to the objectives. And you say now is the time is right. Why now?
Well, I think the reason is that the security environment continues to deteriorate from their point of view. They are seeing challenges from multiple neighbors. It's not just about Taiwan. It's about problems on the Sino-Indian border. It's problems from Japan. It's problems of the United States right now, strengthening all of our alliances in Asia, and not just that, but through other organizations, the Quad, AUKUS, and so on. And so Xi Jinping feels pressured. He feels threatened, and he understands that you can't defeat all those threats just by economic tools alone. You need to have a strong military with a coercive power and deterrent power. But it's also specifically, it is about the Taiwan problem set. What they view, they meaning the Chinese leadership, is a slide towards Taiwan independence. They're saying that peaceful reunification might not be possible going forward into the future. And we need to have credible military options if peaceful reunification were to fail to solve this problem through non-peaceful means. And so they have been particularly worried about that here over the last several years under President Tsai Ing-wen, who they view as essentially an independence advocate. and they view the United States as, in one way or another, supporting that. And so this is all creating tension and stress, and even to some degree, I think, paranoia in their system about how much challenge they're facing. And they regard the military as really a central pillar to beating back those challenges.
With regard to Taiwan, we've been told several times here on Frontline that China will be watching very closely how resolute Western countries and NATO allies are in supporting Ukraine against Russia. China sends fighter jets on a nearly daily basis close to the Taiwanese airspace, and its navy is also making its presence felt in the region. What is China trying to do exactly with these deployments, with these movements?
Well, what we're seeing in the news is a coercive campaign. They're trying to exert as much psychological pressure on Taiwan to convince them not to go down the path of independence. They are having an election in January, and so they are trying to tell everybody we are not going to tolerate any of these candidates pushing more firmly towards independence. They're also simultaneously sending a message to the United States. We have had senior political leaders make a habit of going to Taiwan at sensitive times, and the Chinese are telling us as well, we're not going to try to tolerate that. So it's coercive, it's pressure. It's not necessarily right now a sign or a preparation of an imminent war or armed conflict, but it is ramping up. And it's also, in addition to coercion, it's giving their forces some opportunities to train in the locations where at some point in the future they may have to operate in wartime. But these deployments right now are not setting the stage. This is not a dress rehearsal for a war. It's really about psychological pressure.
Could it be, though, also like testing out the reaction when they do these kind of daily flights to see what NATO allies see, what the West says about it?
Well, I think what they're testing, if they're probing defenses, they're really trying to understand what Taiwan is going to throw back at them. So they are testing, for example, the radars, the ability of Taiwan to quickly get jets up into the air to intercept, to get ships to sea to intercept ships that are coming towards them, and so on. So yes, they are testing the defenses. This isn't so much, I think, about necessarily testing NATO or the United States. It's certainly about trying to understand, and even I think to some degree, perhaps wear down Taiwan's readiness and defenses right now. And by the way, Taiwan itself, in terms of its own modernization and reforms, is lagging behind. So I think as China improves, as they do this kind of activity, it's kind of making the playing field even less even, if you will, for Taiwan.
And how closely will the Five Eyes intelligence alliance of the US, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand be looking at this? How closely will they be watching? What will they be looking for?
I think that the Five Eyes, as well as our other bilateral alliances in Asia, do coordinate. They are thinking about, they are talking about this problem set. They're trying to understand what, for example, what would be the signs that China actually is gearing up for war? What would be the indications? What would be the warning signs for that? How do we evaluate China's hardware capabilities? How do we evaluate the success of their actual operations? And also, what is the situation going on in Taiwan right now? How ready are they? And what can we do collectively to try to help them a bit, to get them better ready to defend themselves? So I think there is a lot of coordination and cooperation. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that all these countries will intervene. If there is a real military clash in Asia, and many of these countries may not. But certainly from a diplomatic and intelligence point of view, I think there is a very high degree of coordination and cooperation right now.
You mentioned at the beginning that China is not yet a global power. The UK struggles to decide how to define the risk posed by China. If you take into account the confrontations between the Chinese and Indian forces in their territorial disputes, the more threatening posture in the South China Sea, and the constant military pressures we talked about on Taiwan, what do you think?
Well, I think, China certainly it has global reach. And so there are implications for friends in Europe. Or, for example, we have seen now China sending out its military for peaceful purposes, although they are trying to use the PLA to get influence, especially in Eastern Europe. They go into the Eastern Mediterranean, and there are questions about their long-term aspirations. In my view, however, the key problem is not whether China will deploy military forces, which I think will be very difficult for them globally. To me, the problem is whether they have enough influence in critical countries to prevent us as a coalition, as the United States, as Britain, as others, from getting access that we may need militarily in the future. So China is one of the largest trading partners, one of the largest investors in a number of countries that historically have given us military privileges, overflight, basing, and access. And so I think the key issue for us to consider is, does China have so much influence now that they can essentially veto interventions that we might want to do in the future outside of Asia?
The resolve to counter China is manifested in AUKUS, a security pact between the US, the UK and Australia to build nuclear-powered attack submarines for Australia by the late 2030s. Do you see that as a kind of escalation in tensions in this part of the world, or does China see it in that way?
No, China absolutely sees AUKUS as a further step in a containment strategy led by the United States and supported by our allies. I don't think they're surprised. I think they are worried, in particular about the submarine dimensions of this, which I think they believe will reduce their ability to gain an advantage, especially in the undersea domain. But they're also looking at cooperation between the US, Australia, and Britain in high technology fields, such as hypersonic technology and even things like counter hypersonic technology. This is important because one of the sort of ace cards that China is building for its military are very high-end missiles fitted with something called hypersonic technology. And this makes these missiles very, very difficult for us to intercept. So if you think about the military balance in the Pacific, this could be a game changer for them. However, if the United States and our allies are building defensive technology, the ability to counter that, then I think that could reduce China's optimism in its own military forces.
And there have been reports of the Chinese submarine caught in its own submarine chain trap designed to counter Western submarine activity. It's reported that the crew was killed by this malfunctioning air system. Do you know anything about this? Do you know whether there's any truth in these reports? Because China hasn't responded as far as I know.
I've seen the reports, including recently in British media. I don't think there's actually any proof as yet that this reported submarine accident took place. This is possibly misinformation put out there on social media that's gotten traction. I'm waiting further evidence that something like this has actually happened. Now, it's possible, right? And China did have a major fatal submarine accident back in 2003, and they are experimenting with different technologies. So problems can happen for militaries. But in this specific case, I don't know that there's actually conclusive evidence that this has happened yet.
Are you aware that there exist these chain traps that are mentioned in this report?
I wouldn't be surprised that they are experimenting with devices that would be designed to snarl submarines. However, I don't know that technology is mature. I don't know that in this particular case it was deployed. And so, there are a lot of different aspects of this story that essentially are unconfirmable. It is a real submarine, and this is a real submarine captain. He's a real person. But whether or not this is a fictitious social media invention or a real story, I think the jury's still out on this.
Let's turn back to the war in Ukraine. To what extent is this, do you think, being used as an opportunity by President Xi to shake up his military while the world is dealing with other pressing priorities?
Well, I think he sees the war in Ukraine more as a cautionary tale than as an opportunity. I think what he's observed in Ukraine, number one, is a very high and surprising level of coordination between the United States and our allies in sanctioning Russia, even when countries have had to pay a real cost. And so I think Xi Jinping worries what happens if he goes against Taiwan? Will there be a very high level of sanctions? Second, for his military, it's a wake-up call. The PLA regarded the Russians really as among the world's finest. They have a very similar doctrine, some similar organization as the PLA, but it didn't work very well at all in Ukraine. In fact, they had very, very big troubles at the outset, and they're in kind of a stalemate or a quagmire right now. And so I think the PLA is trying to think, well, what does this mean for us? Do we need to further reform? But not only that, do we need to potentially prepare for a larger, longer scale, protracted conflict? And so I think they're thinking through how do we protect our supply chains? How do we build enough munitions for a longer war? How do we get after some of the problems they're observing the Russians in Ukraine? So I think it's worrisome for the PLA more so than an opportunity.
And you mentioned earlier China's hypersonic missile capabilities. Russia is another nation that vaunts its hypersonic missiles. Is this something they could be cooperating on?
It's possible that they could be cooperating on right now, although I think from what we can say, the Chinese have been somewhat cautious in dealing with advanced technology right now from the Russians. They continue to purchase some Russian arms. So advanced air defenses, some of their jet engines they purchase from Russia. But in terms of sending military equipment, for example, China has larger stockpiles of hypersonic. Sending this kind of equipment to the Russians, this still seems to be a red line they don't want to cross because they understand they will be vulnerable to secondary sanctions.
And we've seen the recent strengthening of relations between Russia and China. They conducted a joint military exercise in the summer in the Sea of Japan. How likely is it, do you think, that they will be strengthening and coordinating their actions to further challenge NATO and its allies?
Well, I think when we look at their military exercises, their naval exercises, and so on, a lot of these are, if you will, performative acts. They're symbolic. They're not large-scale, real combat-focused exercises like the United States does with our allies. And so there is a bit of showmanship that goes on with this. I think the Chinese are wary. I think they're a little bit wary about showing their more sensitive capabilities to the Russians and vice versa. And I think they're worried about being seen as a military ally of the Russians. The Chinese they're balancing, they're hedging. They're not doing nothing, but they're not going so far that they're going to be sacrificing or endangering their relations, both with Europe and, for that matter, with the United States right now, which they are trying to stabilize somewhat. And so I think for them, they've been cautious in these sorts of endeavors.
So in that light, then, you mentioned earlier that China wants to be war ready, and it's set a date for that. I mean, how likely do you think that the next conflict will involve China, or do you think that is something at the moment that is certainly not on the table at all?
Well, I think a conflict is certainly on the table for China. I think they are trying to understand the costs and the risks and the rewards. My point of view is that they have decided right now that the time isn't right for them. The economic costs are so high. And
by that, do you mean Taiwan in that sense?
Exactly. Certainly Taiwan is the most likely case if there's going to be a conflict. I think the Chinese are getting better. I think they are starting to try to inoculate their economy from sanctions. Their military is improving the level of their training, and they're bringing more capabilities online to give themselves the option sometime in the future to do this. From our perspective here in the United States, I think the idea of deterrence is to keep that risk-reward calculation pivoting against a war optimism. And so that means that we have to keep our own game up. We have to keep up ready forces in the Pacific. We have to work well with our allies, and we have to convince the Chinese that we do have skin in the game here. Taiwan does matter, and the future of stability in Asia, it matters quite a lot to us. And so if they are going to take a lesson from Ukraine, the West is not going to intervene, you are going to become very scared of us and our nuclear arsenal. No, I think we have to convince them that this is a very important interest for the United States and the West, and so as to influence their calculations on going to war.
Joel Wuthnow, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now or listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. But for now, though, from me, Kate Chabot, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.